My stepmom made me her servant in my own house for years. But when I turned 21, a lawyer revealed I legally owned everything. And I kicked them out with police. Susan tried to steal my dead mom's jewelry, but the cameras exposed her. I'm 22 years old. I work at Starbucks while taking online classes, and I basically just kicked my stepmother and her two kids out of my house. Yes, my house, legally mine, even though they lived here thinking it was my dad's for years. The story is long, but trust me, it's worth it because Susan's face when I showed her the property papers was probably the best moment of my life so far. I guess I should start at the beginning. My mom died of breast cancer when I was 8 years old. It was horrible, obviously. Like one of those things that marks your life forever. You know? My dad, who was like 32 at the time, was devastated. And honestly, I don't know how we would have survived without my maternal grandparents. They moved in with us almost immediately after the funeral, sold their house in Florida, and literally dedicated themselves to taking care of me while my dad tried to keep his head above water. I remember my grandma made pancakes every Sunday, and my grandpa taught me how to ride a bike in the park, things my dad just couldn't do because he was too deep in his grief. What I didn't know at the time, because I was a kid, was that my grandparents also bought a new house for all of us. A big 4-bedroom house in a really nice neighborhood near Boston. My dad never put a cent toward the purchase, but since he was so emotionally messed up, I think my grandparents just took charge of everything and he let it happen. The house was beautiful. It had a decent backyard. It was close to good schools, all that. The 4 of us lived there for years, and they were good years, honestly. My grandparents adored me, spoiled me quite a bit, and my dad eventually started functioning again like a normal person. So when I was like 10, my dad met Susan at a business conference. He worked in software sales or something like that. I don't know exactly what he does to this day because he never explained it well. Anyway, he met Susan, who was 31 at the time, and she was all smiles and charm at first. My grandparents didn't like her. I can say that now with absolute certainty. But they were polite to her because my dad seemed happy for the first time in years. They got married like 6 months after meeting, which looking back was a giant red flag, but whatever. Love is blind or whatever. Susan had 2 kids from a previous marriage. Jason, who was 13 when they moved in, and Taylor, who was 9, around my age. My dad sold us this whole idea that we were going to be a happy blended family, like those cheesy Disney movies. But the reality was completely different from day one. Susan moved into our house because obviously it was much bigger and nicer than her 2-bedroom apartment and brought all her stuff and basically started redecorating everything. She threw out my mom's photos that were in the living room, said we needed to move forward. And when my grandparents protested, she cried and told my dad they weren't making her feel welcome. My dad, being the people-pleasing idiot he is, sided with her. Things gradually got worse. Susan started assigning me household chores, like small ones at first, washing dishes after dinner, taking out the trash, normal things any kid would do. But then it became more and more. Jason and Taylor did nothing, literally nothing. And when I complained, Susan would say it was important that I learn responsibility or some shit like that. My grandparents noticed, obviously, but Susan was smart and only made things worse when they weren't around or when my dad was away on business trips. When I was 16, my grandparents died 6 months apart. First my grandpa from a heart attack, and then my grandma, who I honestly think died of sadness because she didn't want to be here without him. It was in 2019, and it was devastating, like completely destroying for me because they had been my anchor after mom died. What I didn't know, what nobody apparently knew except my grandparents' lawyer, was that they had put the house deed in my name before they died. The house was technically mine since I turned 16, but the lawyer had instructions not to tell me anything until I turned 21. Something about protecting me from manipulation or making sure I was mature enough to handle the situation. My grandparents were smart. I guess they saw all this disaster coming. After they died, Susan became absolutely unbearable. Without my grandparents there to keep her in line, she basically turned me into the house servant. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning to make everyone's breakfast before going to school, cleaned the entire house on weekends, did everyone's laundry, cooked dinner almost every night. Jason, who was like 21 by then, didn't work, just played video games in his room all day and said he was trying to be a content creator or streamer or something. Taylor was in college, studying communications, I think, and was obsessed with Instagram and TikTok, taking pictures of herself all day. Neither of them did. absolutely anything in the house. My dad was absent most of the time, either literally because he traveled for work or emotionally because he just didn't want to deal with the drama. When I tried to talk to him, Susan would cry and say I was being disrespectful to her, that I didn't appreciate everything she did for me, blah blah blah. And my dad, being the coward he is, always took her side. It was easier for him to keep me quiet than confront his wife, I guess. I graduated high school and couldn't go away to college because there simply wasn't money for that, or so they told me. Susan told me that if I wanted to go to college, I could get student loans and do it myself, but not to expect help from them. So I got the job at Starbucks, started taking online classes at a community college, and kept living in the house doing all the work while Jason and Taylor lived like parasites. I paid some money to help with expenses, which Susan demanded from me. Though looking back, I probably didn't even have to do it because the house was paid off and there was no mortgage. Everything came to a head like 6 months ago. I had just turned 21, was working full-time at Starbucks plus online classes, and Susan decided I needed to start paying official rent. She told me she wanted $800 a month plus utilities, and when I just stared at her like, "Are you kidding me?" She said if I didn't like it, I could leave. Jason and Taylor, of course, didn't have to pay anything, because according to Susan, Jason was building his career, and Taylor was a student. I was also a student, but apparently that didn't count. It was right then that I got the mail from my grandparents' lawyer, a certified letter saying I needed to go to his office to discuss my inheritance. I went thinking maybe they had left me some money. I don't know, a few $1,000s or something. I never imagined what the lawyer was going to tell me. He sat there with all these papers and explained to me that the house, the entire house, was in my name since I turned 16. My grandparents had bought it completely. There was never a mortgage, and they specifically put it in my name to protect me from Susan, because apparently they saw her coming from the beginning. The lawyer had a letter from my grandma explaining everything, saying they wanted to make sure I always had a home, that Susan could never kick me out, and that when I was ready, I'd have the power to make my own decisions. I sat in that office probably like 20 minutes, unable to process the information. The house was mine? All this time Susan had been acting like lady of the manor of my house? Jason had been in his room playing video games in my house without paying anything? Taylor had been taking selfies in my house like she was a princess? The rage I felt was indescribable. Like I felt like my head was going to explode. The lawyer advised me to think carefully about how to handle the situation, to consult with him before making any drastic moves, but honestly, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I went home that day and acted completely normal. I made dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and waited. The following Sunday, we had one of those forced family dinners that Susan insisted on doing to pretend we were a functional family. We were all sitting at the table, including my dad who happened to be home, and Susan was talking about how they needed to redecorate the living room again, like for the 5th time in recent years. Then she dropped the bomb about my rent, telling my dad in front of everyone that I was going to start paying $800 a month or I'd have to leave. That's when I dropped my fork with a really loud noise against the plate and said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "I'm not going to pay rent in my own house." Susan laughed, like that condescending laugh she always used with me, and said something like, "Honey, this is your father's house, not yours." And I pulled the property papers out of my backpack and put them on the table. The silence that followed was beautiful. Susan grabbed the papers, read them, and I watched her go pale in real time. My dad was confused. Jason stopped looking at his phone for the first time in years, and Taylor literally opened her mouth like a fish. "What is this?" Susan asked, and her voice sounded weird, like shaky. "It's the house deed," I said. "In my name. My grandparents bought it and put it in my name when I was 16 years old. This house is legally mine and has been for 5 years. Susan started stammering something about how that was impossible, that it had to be a mistake, that my grandparents wouldn't do that. My dad stayed quiet, which honestly was worse than if he had said something, because it meant he probably suspected it or knew it on some level. Jason muttered something about this being crazy, and Taylor started crying, because of course, she always cried when things didn't go her way. "So, I continued, because I was already in this and wasn't going to back down. About that rent you mentioned? If you're going to live in my house, Susan, I think $1,200 a month is fair. Same for Jason and Taylor. Each. That's $3,600 a month total, plus utilities split between the three of you. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. You're crazy, she screamed. This is ridiculous. I'm not paying that. And I just shrugged and said, then I guess you'll need to find another place to live. What followed was like 2 weeks of the most absolute drama I've experienced in my life. Susan tried everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. First, she tried to convince my dad to force me to go away to college, telling him it would be better for my education, that I was being selfish by staying, all kinds of manipulation. My dad, to his credit, finally grew a pair and told her he couldn't force me to do anything because legally I was the owner. Susan had a complete mental breakdown, screaming and crying and throwing things. I installed a recorder on my phone and captured everything, just in case. Then Susan tried to be sweet with me, which was disturbing. She'd make me breakfast, ask me how I was, tried to have heart-to-heart conversations where she basically tried to guilt-trip me about breaking up the family. I told her the family was already broken and she'd been the one holding the hammer. She didn't like that. Then came the threats phase. She told me she was going to sue me, that she was going to prove my grandparents were senile when they made the deed, that she was going to get the house taken away from me. I went to my grandparents' lawyer again, showed him everything, and he helped me draft official eviction notices. 30 days notice, all legal and proper. I hired a notary to deliver the papers personally to Susan, Jason, and Taylor. Their faces when they received them were almost as good as when I showed them the deed. Susan tried to stay, obviously. When eviction day came, she was sitting in the living room like nothing was wrong, saying she wasn't going anywhere. I had called the police beforehand to let them know I might need help, and they sent an officer to supervise. I had also hired a moving truck and 2 guys to pack their stuff, because I knew she wouldn't do it. The officer explained very clearly to them that if they didn't leave voluntarily, he was going to escort them out, and I could put their belongings on the street. But before all that, something happened that still makes me furious. 2 days before the final eviction, I installed security cameras all over the house, especially in my room. And thank God I did, because I caught Susan trying to steal my mom's jewelry. I had kept it in a safe box in my closet, things my grandparents had saved for me, and this woman literally tried to take them. I saw her in real time on my phone while I was at work, going into my room, rummaging through my closet, finding the box. She couldn't open it because it had a combination lock, but just the attempt was enough. I left work immediately, got home, and confronted her with the video. She tried to say she was just looking for something she had left there, but I had the video showing her specifically looking for the safe box. I called the police and filed a report. They didn't arrest her or anything because technically she didn't manage to steal anything, but it went on record, and the officer made it very clear to her that if she tried anything else, she was going to have serious legal problems. Eviction day was surreal. The movers arrived early and started packing all of Susan's, Jason's, and Taylor's stuff. Susan tried to give a dramatic speech about how I was going to regret this, how I was going to be alone, how nobody was ever going to love me, basically trying to destroy me emotionally one last time. I just stood there with my arms crossed, waiting for her to finish. When she finally shut up, I told her, "Thanks for confirming that kicking everyone out of here was the right decision." Jason didn't say anything the whole process, just loaded his stuff with a zombie face. Taylor cried the whole time, taking selfies with tears for her Instagram stories, because obviously she needed to document her tragedy to get sympathy on the internet. My dad stayed quiet during the whole process. I think part of him knew they deserved it, but another part was angry at me for causing this explosion. He told me Susan was his wife and he had to go with her, and I told him it was his choice. He could stay if he wanted, but Susan and her kids had to leave. He chose to leave with her, which hurt more than I expected, but was also liberating in a way. At least I didn't have to pretend anymore that we had a functional father-daughter relationship. They went to live with Susan's sister in a 2-bedroom apartment. Apparently, Jason finally got a job at GameStop, which is ironic considering he spent years playing video games instead of working. Taylor is staying with different friends because she doesn't want to be in the cramped apartment. Susan is miserable, according to what people who still have contact with them have told me, constantly complaining about how unfair I am, how I stole her home, conveniently ignoring that she lived in my house for free for years while treating me like trash. After they left, the house felt incredibly peaceful for the first time in years. I redecorated the rooms they had occupied, painted the walls of my room a blue I'd always wanted, put my mom's photos back in the living room. I hired Michelle, who was my mom's best friend, to live in one of the rooms. She pays fair rent, not excessive, and honestly, she's become more family to me than Susan ever was. We cook together, watch movies, and she tells me stories about my mom that make me feel connected to her again. Last week, my dad called me for the first time since he left. He wanted to know if he could come get some things he had left, and I told him yes, but that Susan wasn't welcome. He came alone, and it was weird, like super awkward. He tried to have a conversation about how things got out of control, how maybe we all made mistakes, and I just let him talk. I didn't apologize because I didn't do anything wrong. I told him the door was open for him if he ever decided to choose me over Susan, but that I wasn't going to put up with his indifference or compliance with his abusive wife anymore. I don't know what's going to happen with that relationship. Part of me wants my dad to wake up and realize how toxic Susan is, but another part doesn't care anymore. I've spent too many years waiting for him to be the father I needed, and now I'm focused on building the life my grandparents wanted me to have. A life where I'm not anyone's servant, where my house is really my home, where I can breathe without feeling like I'm walking on eggshells all the time. My grandparents gave me more than a house. They gave me the power to take control of my own life, and even though it took me years to understand that and use it, I finally did, and I don't regret anything.